Hello and welcome to Corvus Painting. Today we're painting a White Scar Space Marine Intercessor in the Grimdark style. We'll be using the equipment listed here within this video, however feel free to make substitutions with similar paints or brands. We use Citadel White Scar as our primer today. Other white primers will do the job, but this is just my go-to white primer. To begin this paint job we're first going to be using Basilicanum Grey contrast. We will thin it roughly 50-50 with water or contrast medium. We are then going to cover the whole model. Make sure to get into all the recesses. This step may look like you're painting a Black Templar, but don't be worried, we'll bring that white back in the next step. After, the model should look something like this. We are then going to be using a makeup sponge. We will dampen the sponge and then rinse out the majority of the water. Make sure it's not too wet, because it could make the paint too runny, but just damp enough to make the paint flow correctly. We will then be using Corax White. Apply a small amount of paint to our palette and add a small amount of water. We then apply the paint to our sponge, working it into the sponge and then testing it on our palette or hand so that we don't overload the model. Then we'll apply the paint to the model, covering all the armour panels and the majority of the model. Just don't push it in too hard as we want to keep the grey in the recesses. After the model has dried, we'll apply a second coat of Corax White to the model. This time focus more so on the top of the model and the flat panels. Then we'll come in with White Scar and focus on the top of the model. Make sure you test your sponge on your palette or hand before committing to the model, as we don't want to flood the model with this paint. The next step will be using Abaddon Black to fill in all the details we wish to be black or silver. This will be the undersuit, tubes, weapons and leather details. Make sure to thin your paint with a little bit of water, and it will take 2 coats for full coverage. Then we're going to be using Mephiston Red. This will be used for the chest aquila as well as the small chapter symbol on the left knee pad. For this detail I started by outlining 2 angled lines. I then joined them up to each other as well as joining them to the top and bottom of the knee pad. Slowly fill in those details Take your time as you go, make sure not to fill up your brush too much as you do this. Details such as this add extra character and are a good practice for developing brush control, as well as a good way to start freehanding. If you do make any mistakes, as I have, use some thinned white scar to cover it. Then we'll be highlighting the red details with Evil Sunz Scarlet. When highlighting the Aquila, try and catch the raised details such as the skull, and lightly drag your brush across the ends of the wings. We'll then be using Warpstone Glow to paint the eyes. If you prefer red lenses, just use one of the previous red paints. To paint the eyes, I find it best to move the model into position rather than trying to bring the brush in there. Bring the model in close and tilt the lenses to match your brush, and make sure not to overload your brush when doing this. Then it's onto the silver details. We'll be using Leadbelcher for this step. Thin the paint slightly, and as we've blacked out all the details we want metallic, the paint should work nicely. Painting the silver will probably take 2 thin coats, but as we've blacked out the details, the paint will adhere pretty well to the model. Next is the transfers. As the white scars use red treat markings, I couldn't find one as easily as you can for other chapters. However, if you cut the bottom arrow off a Dark Angel's marking, you end up with a transfer which is perfect for the white scars. So using a hobby knife, I removed the bottom arrow. We'll be using Micro Set and Micro Sol for the transfers today. First, apply some Micro Set on top of the transfer, as well as the panels we're going to be adding the transfers to. In this case, it'll be both shoulder pauldrons. Then with your brush, move the transfer onto the pauldron and position it in place. Once you're happy, gently remove any excess Micro Set with some kitchen roll and apply a layer of Micro Sol to fix it in position. After leaving the model to dry overnight, we will then add a matte varnish, in this case matte varnish by the Colour Forge. This helps protect the model from the white spirits we'll later use, as well as adding a nice matte finish. I like to leave it to dry for a day so that the next step doesn't cause any damage to the varnish. We'll then be using streaking grime. As this is an enamel based paint, be careful. Make sure you have good ventilation, and if you're a youngster or uncomfortable with enamels, stick to washes like Agrax Earthshade and skip this phase. I like to use 2 plastic cups, one for the grime and one for white spirits, and use an old brush to apply the grime. Using that old brush, apply the grime all over the model. At this point you may think you've ruined the paint job, but don't worry. We'll then be using 2 foam eyeshadow applicators. Dip one end in the white spirits and start removing the grime towards the bottom end of the model. The main focus is to keep the grime in the recesses in the lower section and remove it from the details and upper sections of the model. When using streaking grime, it's all up to personal taste, so make your model as messy or as clean as you'd like. Then I come in with an eyeshadow applicator which hasn't been put in white spirits and just remove some of the excess. This helps soak up the white spirits as well as removing some of the extra grime. Give the model a few hours to dry and then we're on to the final steps. We'll then be adding some battle damage to the model. For this we'll be starting with white scar and using a small piece of sponge with tweezers. Make sure you don't overload your sponge and give it a few test dabs on your palette or hand, and once happy start applying it to the corners of your model's armour. Aim for areas which would likely get damaged over time, such as the legs and pauldrons. I find it better to build up the chipping detail, so don't add loads at once, rather keep going back with less paint on the sponge. Then we'll use Abaddon Black. Get a new bit of sponge and this time add less paint. Go over the same areas as we previously chipped and make sure you retain some of that white chipping. The last step for the chipping is to come back with Leadbelcher. Use a small brush and the side of the brush to edge highlight the chip details. This really completes the 3D effect and makes the armour look like the paint has been stripped away. Also, while we're using Leadbelcher, we'll add some highlight details to the weapon and silver details. After that step is complete, we'll add some highlight to the red details with Evil Sunz Scarlet. Using the same technique as before, we'll highlight all the raised areas across the wings. Then add a final highlight of Warpstone Glow to the lenses to make them pop out a little bit. And then it's just down to basing. For my models I like to paint the base black using Abaddon Black. And then using an old paintbrush, go over the base with Geek Gaming basing glue. And dunk the model in some Geek Gaming Grimdark City rubble, and give it a little tap to remove the excess from the base. We'll then repaint the rim of the base with Abaddon Black, and there we have it, a completed white scar. As you can see, painting white doesn't need to be scary. Hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and found it useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe and give me any suggestions of what you might like to see next. Until next time, thank you.